The St. Louis Cathedral stands sentinel overlooking Jackson Square in the New Orleans French Quarter. Its towering triple steeples have become an iconic landmark of the city. The French were the first to use the present-day site in 1727, nestling the Catholic Church in the heart of their planned city, only a stone's throw from the Mississippi River. However, the building that stands today is the last of several in a timeline that practically embodies New Orleans' own, interwoven through both historic and tragic events. But just one of the many things so unique to this architectural masterpiece is that buried underneath the altar of this grand cathedral are the remains of 8 Catholic bishops who once presided here. Their legacies just as entrenched into the fabric of New Orleans' history as the cathedral itself. Each a different man from a different era, serving his own unique role in the development of the city. A city where many claim several of their souls still watch over parishioners, sometimes wandering the alleys of the French Quarter, others still singing hymns in New Orleans' oldest ghost story. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Southern Gothic.
This episode of Southern Gothic is the second of a 3-part series called The Birth of a City. Subscribe now on your favorite podcasting app to receive future episodes.
In April of 1764, King Louis XV of France sent a letter to the governor of Louisiana in New Orleans, informing him the French had ceded control of the city to Spain. The French-Indian War that had erupted over colonial expansion in the Ohio River Valley had not only resulted in the loss of the French territories of Canada and Acadia to the British, but also the French colonies along the Gulf Coast to the Spanish. So in 1762, the Treaty of Fontainebleau was signed, and within 2 years, New Orleans would be part of the Spanish Empire. For a time, New Orleans' French governing body, the Superior Council, continued to operate as if nothing had changed, even after March 5, 1766, when Antonio de Ulloa arrived with 75 Spanish soldiers. He governed loosely for 2 years, his superiors in Havana, Cuba, largely ignoring the city, depriving him of the necessary resources to take complete control. But in 1768, tensions began to flare when the new governor began to flex his muscle, announcing the enforcement of the policies of other Spanish colonies, which restricted all business and trade to the Spanish Empire alone. The French Creoles were furious, and as a result, the first rebellion of a North American colony against its European government began. On October 28, 1768, riots broke out in New Orleans. Planned by French colonial leaders and encouraged by prominent New Orleans families, an armed band of Creoles, Acadians, and Germans poured into the city. But Ulloa's small contingent of soldiers could do little to stifle the rebellion, and the Spanish governor was forced to flee to his ship for safety. The French Superior Council, still effectively running the colony, voted to see Ulloa permanently removed from New Orleans, and 3 days later, the Spanish governor left. Legend suggests his ship was set adrift from the port by a group of drunken Creoles returning from a wedding. Unfortunately for the people of New Orleans, the Spanish did not accept this outcome lightly. On August 16, 1769, a Spanish convoy of 21 ships carrying over 2,000 soldiers and an immense amount of firepower moved quietly into the port of New Orleans under the cover of night. The following morning, they awoke the city with a cannon shot, and when the colonists arrived at the river to investigate, they found a Spanish fleet commanded by their new governor and Captain General of Louisiana, Alejandro O'Reilly. 2 days later, on August 18, 1769, the French flag was formally lowered in New Orleans, and the Spanish flag raised. Without a doubt, New Orleans was no longer French. O'Reilly was an Irish expatriate, and because of his extensive military experience and service to Spain, King Charles charged him with the responsibility to put down the rebellious French in New Orleans, punish those involved, and formally re-establish Spanish possession of the colony. So upon arrival in the colony, O'Reilly sent out spies to assemble a list of suspected rebels, most notably Denis Nicolas Foucault and Nicolas Chauvin de Lafreniere, both members of the Superior Council that plotted the rebellion, as well as Joseph Villeray, who roused the Acadian and Germans to the cause. The governor then ordered a full pardon to all of the other citizens of the colony who had taken part in the revolt in return for their sworn and signed allegiance to Spain's King Charles III. But these men would then face 2 months of trials for their leadership in the rebellion, and these trials were without a jury or any form of public hearing. Instead, O'Reilly convicted the men of sedition and treason himself. 5 of these men, including Lafreniere, were executed by firing squad. Foucault was exiled from New Orleans to be imprisoned in France, and the rest of the riot's leadership were sent to Havana. The exact fate of Joseph Villeray is unknown, but it's thought he was either killed while attempting to evade arrest or while in Spanish captivity. For this, Alejandro O'Reilly was henceforth known to the people of New Orleans as Bloody O'Reilly. But his treachery was only compounded when he then forbade the executed men a proper Catholic funeral and burial, forcing their corpses to be left out to rot in the heat and humidity of the Crescent City. A warning to the French Creoles that treason against Spain would be met with the harshest of punishments. Then, one night, the bodies of these men disappeared. Father Dagobert de Langerie arrived in New Orleans from Quebec in 1722. The Capuchin monk, often described as jolly or rotund, quickly became a very popular and beloved man in the community. He cared for the sick, poor, and destitute of the city, and was eventually named pastor in 1745. When the Spanish took control of New Orleans, Père Dagobert as he was affectionately known by his parishioners, was able to retain his charge. Other than the Spanish clergy criticizing him for being too lax, he remained a beloved and influential member of the community. So when Bloody O'Reilly antagonistically forbade his executed parishioners a proper burial, Dagobert got involved, petitioning the governor numerous times to change his mind. But each time, O'Reilly refused. So Dagobert took action, cementing his place in New Orleans' history and lore. Under the cover of a rainy night, Père Dagobert visited each of the deceased men's families, and one by one, secretly ushered them through the streets of New Orleans to the church, where he locked them quietly in a small room, one at a time. He came and went over and over again through the night, until at some point in the early morning hours, when all the deceased men's beloved had been collected, Dagobert entered the room where they waited and silently gestured for the families to follow him by candlelight into the nave of the church, where they discovered the bodies of their slain loved ones, waiting, each covered respectfully with a dark cloth. Somehow, Père Dagobert had managed to obtain these men from under the noses of the Spanish authorities. He then said a funeral mass before helping the families transport the bodies to the cemetery, where some say they were buried in unmarked graves with no trace of evidence left to be found by the Spanish. Whether Père Dagobert's treasonous action was ever discovered by Bloody O'Reilly is unknown. Père Dagobert remained a prominent figure in the community for another decade, until his untimely death in 1776. The beloved pastor was then interred in a crypt beneath the altar of his church, where he remains to this day. But Dagobert's life was so interwoven into the spiritual and social life of New Orleans that after his death, many believe his spirit remained, fueling the oldest ghost story in the history of the Crescent City. According to legend, on certain nights, when the French Quarter is blanketed by fog, the crisp, clear, and beautiful voice of Père Dagobert can still be heard singing the Kyrie in the alleys beside the St. Louis Cathedral. His spectral voice seemingly coming from nowhere. Some have also claimed he can be found walking silently through the aisles of the cathedral, his head down in prayer. And still others say that his apparition appears on foggy days carrying a lantern, followed by the rebellious Frenchmen whose bodies he purportedly saved. But Père Dagobert isn't the only pastor buried beneath the altar of the St. Louis Cathedral who is believed to still keep watch over New Orleans. After gaining control of the city, Bloody O'Reilly left New Orleans in 1770. During his short reign over Louisiana, he abolished the city's governing superior council and instituted the Cabildo, which consisted of regional councilmen, mayors, and an attorney general to enforce the laws of Spain. It was also under O'Reilly's governorship that additional levees and roads were built, and the enslavement of Native Americans was abolished in the territory. The following decade, when the American War for Independence began, Louisiana Governor Bernardo de Galvez funneled supplies and weapons to the American revolutionaries and began preparing for potential conflict with Great Britain, fortifying the city's defenses along the river before Spain even formally entered the war in 1779. Galvez would not only successfully protect New Orleans during the war, but he would go on to lead an eclectic group of Creoles, Cajuns, Germans, free people of color, and Spanish soldiers to military victories all along the Gulf Coast region, from Baton Rouge to Natchez, from Mobile to Pensacola. It was during this time of conflict, in 1778, when another Capuchin friar made New Orleans home, Father Antonio de Sedela. Unlike Père Dagobert, Père Antoine was a rigid ideologue, sent to the colony as an official of the Spanish Inquisition, charged with maintaining strict Catholic orthodoxy and identifying heretics to the faith. But when the governor of Louisiana, Don Esteban Rodriguez Miro, discovered this, he immediately expelled Père Antoine from the city, sending him back to Spain the very next day, writing to his superiors.
When I read the communication of the Capuchin, I shuddered. The mere name of the Inquisition uttered in New Orleans would not only be sufficient to check immigration, but would also be capable of driving away those who have recently come.
Unfortunately, before his exile, Père Antoine had already played a controversial role in one of New Orleans's most horrific tragedies. At approximately 1:30 on the afternoon of March 21st, 1788, a fire broke out in the home of Army Treasurer Don Nunez. The property, located at the corner of Chartres and Toulouse Streets, only a block from the Plaza de Armas, or what is now known as Jackson Square, became engulfed in flames after a candle fell from the altar in Nunez's private chapel. Unfortunately, this particular windy day was also Good Friday, and in spite of the knowledge that the fire was rapidly spreading around the plaza, engulfing businesses and residences alike, Père Antoine and his fellow priests, out of rigid adherence to Catholic tradition, refused to ring the church bell in warning to their fellow New Orleanians. Tragically, within 5 hours, 856 of New Orleans' 1,100 structures. Yet it was only 6 years later, in 1794, that the city suffered yet another devastating fire, destroying over 200 buildings and resulting in new ordinances which required buildings more than 1 story in height to be constructed with brick and stucco. Much of the Spanish architecture and aesthetic that graces the French Quarter today is a result of this rebuilding of the city. Père Antoine returned to New Orleans the following year, in 1795, eventually becoming the pastor of the St. Louis Cathedral. And while he was often considered a thorn in the side of the city's governing leaders, his infamy as a rigid ideologue faded with time, as he became a beloved member of the community, known not only for his generosity and kindness, but his care for the city's prisoners and slaves. His humble home with a bare floor and hardly anything more than a pallet, rough table, and of course a crucifix, became the center of spiritual authority for the community. Père Antoine died in 1829 at the age of 81. He was mourned by the entire city and memorialized by the Cabildo's passing of an ordinance in which the city council pledged to wear black crepe on their arms in his honor for 30 days. He was then interred in the St. Louis Cathedral alongside Père Dagobert. The two Catholic friars were vastly different in their ideology and practice, but both became icons in the community and beloved by their parishioners. Of course, just like his predecessor, Père Dagobert, Antoine's spirit continues to watch over his parishioners. Almost a century after his death, an alley on the northeast side of the St. Louis Cathedral, once known as Cloister Alley, was renamed in his honor. And it's there, in Père Antoine Alley, as well as in the small secluded garden to the rear of the cathedral that was dedicated to the pastor, that many believe his soul still silently roams. But more common to New Orleans legend is that Père Antoine's apparition can often be seen in the cathedral itself during the holiday season, when he is said to return to say Mass for the people of New Orleans. The Spanish continued to govern New Orleans until 1802, when King Charles IV retroceded the region to France. But in spite of 4 decades of rule, New Orleans was never truly a Spanish city. Its customs and traditions, culture and language remained firmly French. Those who arrived into the colony from Spain often integrated into the already established French families and social order. And since the Spanish were a Catholic empire, there was little change to the spiritual bedrock of the city. Perhaps the greatest impact that the Spanish did have, though, was the distinct architecture used to rebuild New Orleans following the devastating fires of 1788 and 1794. Iconic architecture, still prevalent today, readily identified with this great American city. One such structure is the Cabildo Building, erected to serve as the seat of the Spanish government in colonial Louisiana. It still stands in Jackson Square, just across Pirates Alley from the St. Louis Cathedral. This iconic pairing of buildings serve as powerful symbols of the spiritual and cultural growth of this unique city. A city that some believe still continues to be watched over by some of its most beloved spiritual leaders. My name is Brandon Scheck-Snyder, and you've been listening to Southern Gothic.
This special episode of Southern Gothic contains special theme music written and performed by Grammy-nominated singer-songwriter Adam Wright, as well as a performance by veteran blues harpist Bob Hemphill, and a guest cameo by Javier Leiva of Pretend Radio. All other content is written and produced by Brandon and Brianne Schexnayder. To keep up with future episodes, subscribe today on Apple's podcast app, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you're listening now.
Lucky Little Shacks.